She's going to need help paying her bills now, my daughter-in-law whispered at my husband's funeral, loud enough for 3 people around her to hear. I stood less than 10 feet away. None of them realized I had heard every word. None of them realized that I controlled $28 million. I said nothing. I simply adjusted the sleeve of my black dress and kept walking. I'm Elellanar Whitmore. I was 72 years old the day I buried my husband, Richard. We had been married for 48 years. 48 years of shared mornings, shared worries, shared dreams, and quiet evenings on the back porch watching the sun disappear behind the trees. Now all of that was gone. The church felt colder than it should have. Friends filled the pews. Family members gathered in small circles. Everyone wore black. Everyone spoke softly. Yet beneath the sympathy and polite smiles, I sensed something else. Curiosity, calculation, expectation. Richard had been successful. Very successful. People knew that much. What they didn't know was how carefully he had structured everything long before his passing. As I greeted guests, I noticed my son Daniel standing near the entrance with his wife, Vanessa. He looked tired. Grief had settled heavily on his face. But Vanessa looked different. Alert, focused, almost energized. She moved from group to group, accepting condolences as though she were hosting an event. Several times I saw her glance toward me before quickly looking away. During the service, I sat alone in the front row. The empty space beside me felt unbearable. Richard's folded American flag rested nearby. The pastor spoke about kindness, loyalty, and family. Words that should have brought comfort. Instead, they made me think about the conversations I had overheard during the past week. Little comments. Small assumptions. Tiny cracks revealing what people truly believed. They thought I was vulnerable. They thought I was frightened. Most of all, they thought I was financially dependent on them. After the service, everyone gathered in the fellowship hall for a reception. Round tables filled the room. Coffee brewed in silver urns near the wall. Plates of sandwiches and cookies sat untouched as guests continued sharing stories about Richard. I carried a paper cup of coffee toward an empty chair when I heard Vanessa again. We'll probably need to figure out what to do with the house, she was saying. It's too much for one person. A woman beside her nodded sympathetically. Poor Eleanor. Starting over at her age won't be easy. Vanessa sighed dramatically. No, it won't. I almost smiled. Starting over. That was how they saw me. A helpless widow facing financial uncertainty. A woman whose future would depend on the generosity of others. Nobody asked what Richard and I had planned. Nobody asked what I already knew. They simply filled the silence with assumptions. I sat down at a corner table and listened. Daniel eventually joined Vanessa. They spoke quietly, but their expressions told me enough. Concern mixed with expectation. Grief mixed with anticipation. For the first time, I realized something painful. My husband's funeral was revealing more than the end of his life. It was revealing the true character of people I thought I knew. I looked around the room one final time. Friends wiped away tears. Family members exchanged careful smiles. Vanessa laughed softly at something someone said. Then she glanced toward me again. Her eyes lingered for a moment before she looked away. I lowered my gaze to my coffee and thought about the secret Richard had spent years protecting. A secret neither Daniel nor Vanessa knew existed. $28 million. Enough money to change every assumption in that room. Enough money to expose every hidden motive. But Richard had taught me something important. The truth is most powerful when revealed at exactly the right moment. And as I sat quietly at my husband's funeral, listening to people discuss my future as if I were already defeated, I began to understand that moment was getting closer. The house felt unfamiliar when I returned that evening. Not because anything had changed, but because Richard was no longer there. His coat still hung by the front door. His reading glasses remained on the end table beside his favorite chair. A half-finished crossword puzzle rested exactly where he had left it a week earlier. For 48 years, this house had been filled with the small sounds of another person. A coffee cup being set on the counter. Footsteps in the hallway. A quiet voice asking what I wanted for dinner. Now there was only silence. I placed my purse on the kitchen island and stood there longer than necessary. The refrigerator hummed softly. A clock ticked somewhere in the living room. Everything seemed determined to remind me that life had moved forward without asking my permission. I made myself a cup of tea and carried it onto the back porch. Richard and I had spent countless evenings there. In the summer, we watched fireflies drift across the yard. In the winter, we wrapped ourselves in blankets and talked about our grandchildren, our plans, and the future we assumed we would share. I looked at the empty chair beside mine and felt a heaviness settle over me. Yet grief was not the only thing occupying my thoughts anymore. Something else had begun to take shape. During the past several days, I had noticed changes in Daniel. Small things at first. Missed phone calls. Short conversations. Questions that felt strangely practical for a son whose father had just passed away. Questions about maintenance costs, property taxes, insurance policies. At the time, I had dismissed them. People handle loss differently. That was what I told myself. But after the funeral, those memories returned with a different meaning. The next morning, I woke before sunrise. Sleep had become unpredictable. Some nights passed in a blur. Others felt endless. I brewed coffee and sat at the kitchen table while pale morning light filtered through the windows. Around 8 o'clock, my phone rang. Daniel. I answered immediately. For a moment, I hoped he simply wanted to talk, to share memories of his father, to hear my voice. Instead, after a brief greeting, he asked whether I had considered downsizing. I stared at the coffee cup in my hands. Downsizing. Less than 24 hours after the funeral. I kept my voice calm. I told him I had not thought about it. He replied that maintaining such a large property would eventually become difficult. Then he mentioned several retirement communities Vanessa had researched. Retirement communities. The words lingered long after the call ended. I walked through the house afterward, moving slowly from room to room. Family photographs lined the hallway walls. Daniel's school portraits. Vacation pictures. Christmas mornings. Decades of memories preserved behind glass. As I studied those photographs, I realized something unsettling. For years, Richard had quietly shielded me from certain realities. He saw things before I did. He understood people more clearly. Near the end of his life, he had become increasingly careful about financial matters. There had been meetings with attorneys, documents reviewed behind closed doors, decisions he insisted were important. At the time, I trusted him completely and asked very few questions. Now I found myself remembering his exact words from one evening 6 months earlier. We had been sitting on this same porch watching the sunset when he reached over and squeezed my hand. If anything ever happens to me, Eleanor, do not rush. Do not explain yourself. And do not let anyone pressure you into decisions. Back then, I laughed and told him he was worrying too much. Today those words felt different. Deliberate. Almost like a warning. As the afternoon sunlight stretched across the hardwood floors, I stood in Richard's study. The room still smelled faintly of leather and old books. His desk remained perfectly organized, a habit he maintained throughout his entire life. I rested my hand on the back of his chair and looked around. For the first time, I began to wonder whether my husband had seen something coming long before I did. And if he had, I suspected I was about to discover exactly what it was. 2 days later, Vanessa invited herself over without calling first. I heard her car pull into the driveway just after noon. Through the front window, I watched her step out carrying a paper bag from an expensive bakery. Years ago, I would have taken that as a thoughtful gesture. Now I recognized it for what it was. Preparation. She entered with a bright smile and immediately placed the bag on the kitchen counter. I brought your favorite muffins, she said. I thanked her and offered coffee. We sat across from each other at the kitchen table where Richard and I had shared thousands of meals. For a few minutes, she talked about ordinary things. The weather, traffic, a neighbor who had recently moved away. It felt rehearsed. Eventually, the conversation shifted exactly where I knew it would. She glanced around the kitchen before speaking. This house must feel awfully large now. I stirred my coffee slowly. It is quieter. She nodded sympathetically. That is what I mean. A place like this can become overwhelming. There it was. The same theme Daniel had introduced during our phone call. Not grief. Not healing. Logistics. Property. Relocation. I listened without interruption as she described several retirement communities she claimed were wonderful. She spoke about organized activities, transportation services, and maintenance-free living. The entire presentation sounded polished, almost practiced. When she finally paused, I simply smiled and thanked her for her concern. For a moment, disappointment flickered across her face. I had not responded the way she expected. She left an hour later. As soon as her car disappeared down the street, I walked into Richard's study. Something about the conversation had unsettled me, not because of what she said, but because of how determined she seemed to guide my future. I opened one of the desk drawers and found a leather notebook Richard often used during meetings. Most pages contained ordinary notes, appointment reminders, investment observations, names and phone numbers. Then I discovered several entries from the previous year. My eyes moved slowly across the handwriting I knew so well. One note mentioned concerns about family expectations. Another referenced a meeting with Harold Bennett, our attorney. A third sentence caught my attention immediately. Important to protect Eleanor from pressure after I am gone. I read the line 3 times. Protect Eleanor from pressure after I am gone. A chill moved through me. Richard had anticipated this. Somehow, long before his passing, he had recognized a situation that I was only beginning to understand. Later that evening, I found myself studying old family photographs again. In one picture, Daniel was 10 years old, smiling proudly beside a bicycle Richard had saved months to buy. In another, he stood in a graduation gown with his arm around me. Looking at those photographs hurt more than I expected. I kept asking myself when things had changed, when practical concerns became more important than relationships, when conversations became transactions. The following morning, another clue arrived unexpectedly. Harold Bennett called and asked whether I would be available for a meeting the next week. His voice remained professional, but there was a seriousness beneath it. When I asked whether something was wrong, he hesitated before answering. Nothing is wrong, Eleanor. But there are matters Richard wanted addressed personally. After we ended the call, I sat quietly in the living room. Sunlight streamed through the windows. Dust floated lazily through the air. Across from me sat Richard's empty chair. For the first time since the funeral, I felt something stronger than grief. Curiosity. The pieces were beginning to connect. Richard had prepared for something. Harold knew about it. And judging by the increasing interest Daniel and Vanessa showed in my living arrangements, they were operating under assumptions that might soon be challenged. I looked toward the hallway leading to Richard's study and remembered his final advice. Do not rush. Do not explain yourself. And do not let anyone pressure you into decisions. At last, I was beginning to understand why he had said it. The meeting with Harold was scheduled for the following Tuesday morning. Until then, I said very little to anyone. That turned out to be easier than I expected because Daniel and Vanessa seemed more interested in discussing my future than asking how I was coping with the loss of my husband. On Saturday afternoon, Daniel stopped by unexpectedly. He arrived carrying a folder under one arm and wearing the expression of someone preparing for an uncomfortable conversation. We sat in the living room. Sunlight filtered through the curtains, illuminating the framed photographs that covered the mantel. Daniel glanced around the room before finally speaking. Mom, Vanessa and I have been thinking about what is best for you. I almost smiled at the familiarity of the phrase. What is best for you? It was becoming their favorite introduction. I folded my hands in my lap and listened. He explained that the house would require significant upkeep. He mentioned property taxes, landscaping, maintenance, and utilities. Then he opened the folder and slid several brochures across the coffee table. Each one advertised a different retirement community. Bright photographs showed smiling residents attending classes, walking through gardens, and enjoying organized events. Daniel pointed to one particular brochure. This place has excellent reviews. I picked it up and examined the cover. Everything about it looked pleasant enough. Yet what struck me was not the brochure itself. It was the fact that they had already done extensive research without ever asking whether I wanted to leave my home. That was thoughtful of you, I said calmly. Relief immediately appeared on his face. He mistook politeness for agreement. We just want to make sure you are taken care of. I nodded and changed the subject. After he left, I remained seated for a long time. The brochures stayed exactly where he had placed them. A week earlier, I might have viewed his concern as kindness. Now I noticed something different. Neither Daniel nor Vanessa ever spoke about preserving memories. They never talked about the life Richard and I had built together. Their conversations revolved around practical outcomes. Houses, costs, arrangements, transitions. It was as if they had already decided that this chapter of my life was over. That evening, I wandered through the house again. Every room carried traces of Richard. The workshop in the garage, the study filled with books, the kitchen drawer where he stored spare reading glasses because he was forever misplacing them. These things mattered to me. They represented a lifetime. I could not imagine surrendering them simply because someone else found the arrangement more convenient. The next morning, another memory surfaced unexpectedly. About 8 months before his passing, Richard and I attended a family barbecue at Daniel and Vanessa's home. At one point, I had walked onto the back patio looking for a serving spoon. Before they noticed me, I overheard part of a conversation. Vanessa had been discussing real estate values in our neighborhood. At the time, her interest seemed harmless. Looking back, the details felt different. She had known exactly what homes like ours were worth. She had asked unusually specific questions about ownership structures and inheritance. Richard became noticeably quiet afterward. Now I understood why. He had seen connections I missed. By Monday evening, I no longer believed these events were isolated incidents. They formed a pattern. Small comments, strategic conversations, assumptions about decisions that had not yet been made. And at the center of that pattern stood a simple belief. Daniel and Vanessa thought they knew exactly what my future looked like. As I prepared for bed that night, I found myself standing in Richard's study once again. The leather notebook remained on his desk. I opened it and reread the sentence that had been echoing through my thoughts for days. Protect Eleanor from pressure after I am gone. This time, another realization settled over me. Richard had not merely anticipated pressure. He had prepared a response. And if Harold's upcoming meeting was anything like I suspected, I was about to learn exactly what that response was. Tuesday arrived with clear skies and unusually cool air. I left the house earlier than necessary and drove across town to Harold Bennett's office. The building itself was familiar. Richard and I had visited many times over the years, usually for routine matters. Estate planning, business documents, investment reviews. Back then, I rarely paid attention to the details. Richard handled most of those conversations himself. As I parked my car, I found myself wondering how much he had chosen not to tell me. Harold greeted me personally when I arrived. He looked older than I remembered. The past few weeks had clearly affected him as well. He and Richard had been friends for more than 30 years. After offering condolences once again, he led me into a private conference room. A large folder sat waiting on the polished table. Harold remained quiet for several moments before opening it. Richard was very thorough, he finally said. In fact, I would say he spent the last few years making sure every possible scenario had been considered. I listened carefully. He began reviewing documents one by one. Trust agreements, investment structures, property records, legal instructions. The amount of planning surprised me. Richard had organized everything with remarkable precision. Nothing appeared accidental. Nothing seemed unfinished. Several times, Harold paused to explain specific provisions. Certain assets were protected. Certain decisions required my approval alone. Certain accounts could not be accessed by anyone else without my direct authorization. The more he explained, the more a picture began to emerge. Richard had not simply prepared for his passing. He had prepared for what might happen afterward. Eventually, Harold removed a sealed envelope from the folder. My name was written across the front in Richard's handwriting. For a moment, I could not speak. Harold quietly slid it toward me. My hands trembled slightly as I opened it. Inside was a short letter. The first sentence brought tears to my eyes. Richard wrote that if I was reading those words, then he was gone and already missed me terribly. He thanked me for nearly 5 decades of love, patience, and partnership. Then his tone shifted. If people begin treating you differently after I am gone, he wrote, remember that grief reveals character just as clearly as success does. I stared at the page. Every word felt deliberate, as though he were speaking directly to me from across time. He continued by explaining that he had become concerned about certain attitudes he observed within the family. Not actions serious enough to create conflict. Not evidence of wrongdoing. Simply patterns, assumptions, expectations. He encouraged me to trust my judgment and remain patient before making major decisions. By the time I finished reading, the room felt very quiet. Harold waited respectfully before speaking again. There is one more thing Richard wanted you to understand. He turned several pages inside the folder and placed a summary sheet in front of me. My eyes moved slowly across the numbers. For a moment, I thought I had misunderstood them. Then I looked again. Properties, investment portfolios, business holdings, trust assets. The combined total exceeded $28 million. I sat back in my chair. The figure itself did not shock me as much as the realization that Richard had intentionally structured everything to remain private. Daniel did not know. Vanessa certainly did not know. Very few people knew at all. Harold folded his hands. Richard believed privacy would protect you. Suddenly, dozens of recent conversations made sense. The retirement brochures, the discussions about selling the house, the assumptions about my future. They had all been based on incomplete information. As the meeting continued, I learned one final detail. Several key provisions would not be discussed with family members until a formal review meeting scheduled for the following week. Harold asked whether I wished to make any changes beforehand. I looked down at Richard's letter once more and gently shook my head. For the first time since the funeral, I understood exactly why he had told me not to rush. The truth was already working. All I had to do was remain patient a little longer. When I returned home after meeting Harold, I did not feel triumphant. If anything, I felt calmer. For weeks, uncertainty had been quietly growing around me. Now I finally understood the landscape. Richard had anticipated far more than I realized. He had not built walls around his assets. He had built time. Time for the truth to reveal itself. Over the next several days, I made a conscious decision to behave exactly as I always had. I watered the flowers in the backyard. I attended church on Sunday. I met a friend for coffee. Most importantly, I told no one about the meeting with Harold. Not Daniel. Not Vanessa. Not even my closest friends. The less I said, the more others seemed willing to reveal. On Thursday evening, Daniel called again. His voice carried an unusual enthusiasm. He asked whether I had looked through the retirement community brochures. I told him I had glanced at them. He immediately began describing additional options. Larger apartments, better amenities, places closer to his neighborhood. As he spoke, I realized something. He never once asked whether I wanted to stay in my own home. The possibility seemed absent from his thinking. After we ended the call, I sat quietly in Richard's study. Outside the window, the sun was beginning to set. The room glowed with warm amber light. I remembered another conversation from years earlier. Daniel had been in college at the time. He worried constantly about money and the future. Richard had told him that wealth was a useful tool, but a dangerous master. At the time, Daniel nodded and agreed. I wondered whether he remembered that lesson now. The following afternoon, Vanessa stopped by once again. This visit felt different. Less patient. More direct. She complimented the house, commented on the neighborhood, and casually mentioned how strong the real estate market remained. Then she asked whether I had considered speaking with a realtor. I looked at her over the rim of my coffee cup. Why would I do that? I asked gently. The question seemed to catch her off guard. She quickly recovered and explained that many widows preferred simpler living arrangements. Easier maintenance, less responsibility, better quality of life. Her answers sounded polished. Yet beneath them I sensed urgency. Not concern, urgency. When she left, I stood at the front window and watched her drive away. A strange sadness settled over me. Not because of her behavior, because I finally understood how little either of them knew me. They saw age and assumed weakness. They saw grief and assumed confusion. They saw silence and assumed agreement. What they failed to understand was that grief had sharpened my attention. Every conversation now revealed something new. Every assumption exposed another layer. By the weekend, Harold called to confirm the upcoming family review meeting. The date had already been placed on everyone's calendar. Daniel and Vanessa would attend. Several legal documents would be discussed. Harold's tone remained neutral, but I could sense his confidence. Everything was proceeding exactly as Richard intended. After the call ended, I walked through the house one more time. The photographs on the walls no longer made me feel abandoned. Instead, they reminded me of the life Richard and I had built together. A life based on trust, patience, and careful decisions. As I passed through the living room, I paused beside his favorite chair. For the first time since the funeral, I smiled. Not because I missed him any less. I always would. But because I finally understood the gift he had left behind. It was not the money. It was clarity. And soon, everyone else would be forced to see it too. The morning of the family review meeting arrived with a sense of quiet inevitability. I woke early, made coffee, and sat at the kitchen table where Richard and I had shared countless mornings together. Outside, the neighborhood looked exactly the same. A dog walker passed by. Sprinklers clicked rhythmically across a nearby lawn. Ordinary life continued as though nothing significant was about to happen. Yet I knew this day would change several relationships forever. Not because of an argument. Not because of a confrontation. Simply because assumptions were about to meet reality. I arrived at Harold's office 10 minutes early. The receptionist greeted me warmly and guided me to the conference room. The long table looked familiar now. Folders had been arranged neatly at each seat. A pitcher of water sat in the center beside several glasses. I chose a chair near the end of the table and waited quietly. A few minutes later, Daniel and Vanessa arrived together. Vanessa smiled when she saw me. It was the same careful smile she had worn for weeks. Polite, controlled, slightly rehearsed. Daniel kissed my cheek and asked how I was doing. I told him I was fine. Then we all sat down. The atmosphere felt surprisingly relaxed. Vanessa seemed especially confident. She chatted about a recent home renovation project in her neighborhood and casually mentioned rising property values. At one point, she even joked about how difficult it must be for people my age to keep up with large houses. I noticed Harold writing notes without reacting. I simply folded my hands and listened. As the meeting began, Harold reviewed several routine matters: insurance documents, property records, administrative details. Daniel appeared attentive. Vanessa occasionally nodded as though she already understood where everything was headed. The longer the meeting continued, the more comfortable she became. Then something happened that caught my attention. During a discussion about future planning, Vanessa asked whether it would be easier to consolidate certain assets sooner rather than later. The question sounded innocent on the surface. Harold responded professionally, but I noticed the brief glance he gave me. He understood exactly what I understood. They believed this meeting existed to organize my transition into a smaller life. They believed decisions had already been made. What fascinated me was not their confidence. It was how little evidence supported it. Every conclusion they had reached was built on assumptions rather than facts. As the conversation continued, Daniel began discussing practical considerations: maintenance costs, future responsibilities, long-term planning. He spoke kindly, but there was an unmistakable certainty behind his words. He was already imagining outcomes. Vanessa sat beside him with an expression that suggested agreement. Together they looked like people waiting for confirmation rather than information. I remained silent. The room gradually settled into a rhythm. Papers turned. Notes were taken. Questions were answered. Then Harold closed one folder and reached for another. The movement seemed small, but the atmosphere changed immediately. His posture became more formal. The tone of the meeting shifted. Even Daniel noticed. Vanessa stopped smiling. Harold looked around the table before speaking. There are several additional matters Richard instructed me to address personally. The room grew quiet. I felt no excitement, no anger, no desire for revenge, only a calm certainty. Across the table, Daniel straightened in his chair. Vanessa exchanged a quick glance with him. Neither of them understood that the meeting they thought they were attending had not actually begun yet. Everything discussed so far had merely been the introduction. The real conversation was about to start. Harold opened the final folder with deliberate care. No one spoke. The quiet in the room felt different now. Earlier, it had been the comfortable silence of routine business. Now it carried anticipation. Harold adjusted his glasses and looked first at me, then at Daniel and Vanessa. Richard left very specific instructions regarding the structure of his estate, he said. Daniel nodded as though he expected exactly that. Vanessa sat perfectly still, her hands folded neatly on the table. Harold continued. Over the years, Richard transferred significant assets into protected trusts and investment entities. Several documents were distributed across the table. Daniel glanced down at the first page. His expression remained neutral at first. Then he looked again, this time more carefully. Harold began reviewing the figures one section at a time. Real estate holdings, investment accounts, business interests, long-term trust assets. The numbers grew larger with each page. I watched quietly as confusion slowly replaced confidence. Vanessa leaned forward. Daniel flipped back to the first document as though he believed he had misunderstood something. Harold calmly explained how the structures worked. Which assets belonged to which entities. Which accounts remained active. Which properties were held inside trust arrangements. Then he reached the summary page. The room became completely silent. The combined value of these assets currently exceeds $28 million. No one moved. For a moment, even the air seemed still. Daniel stared at the page in front of him. Vanessa blinked several times before looking toward me. The expression on her face was not what I expected. It was not shock alone. It was the sudden realization that an entire narrative she had built inside her mind had been wrong from the beginning. Harold continued speaking, but neither of them seemed fully capable of processing the information. Every assumption they had made during the previous weeks collapsed quietly under the weight of simple facts. The retirement brochures, the discussions about downsizing, the concern about maintenance costs, all of it had been based on a version of reality that never existed. Eventually, Daniel cleared his throat. Mom knew about all of this. Harold answered before I could speak. Yes, Eleanor was fully informed. Daniel looked at me differently then. Not with hostility, not even with embarrassment, more with uncertainty, as though he suddenly realized there were entire parts of my life he had never bothered to understand. Vanessa remained silent. Her eyes moved between the documents and the table surface. For once, she had nothing prepared to say. Harold then explained another important detail. Every major decision involving the assets required my approval. No property could be sold without my authorization. No trust could be altered without my consent. No one would be managing my future on my behalf. I had been entrusted with complete control. As the explanation concluded, the atmosphere in the room changed completely. Earlier, Daniel and Vanessa had arrived expecting to guide a discussion. Now they were listening. Harold closed the folder and folded his hands. Richard believed Eleanor was fully capable of making her own decisions. The statement hung in the air. Simple, direct, impossible to misunderstand. I glanced down at the letter Richard had written. For a moment, I could almost hear his voice. Patient, calm, certain. He had never been interested in proving people wrong. He preferred allowing reality to speak for itself. Looking around the room, I finally understood why. No argument could have taught this lesson more effectively than the truth had. And the truth had only just begun speaking. The meeting ended differently than anyone had expected. No raised voices. No dramatic arguments. No accusations. Just silence. The kind of silence that settles over a room when people suddenly realize they have misunderstood something important. Daniel gathered his papers slowly. Vanessa remained unusually quiet. Even after Harold finished reviewing the final documents, neither of them seemed eager to speak. I understood why. For weeks, they had viewed me through a particular lens. An aging widow. A woman overwhelmed by grief. Someone who would eventually need guidance. Someone whose future would require their management. Now that image had disappeared, Harold walked us toward the lobby. Before we left, he handed me Richard's letter once more. I slipped it carefully into my purse. It felt less like a legal document and more like a final conversation between husband and wife. Outside, the afternoon sun illuminated the parking lot. Daniel approached me before reaching his car. For a moment, he looked very much like the young boy who used to ask his father for advice. The confidence from earlier was gone. In its place stood uncertainty. Mom, he said quietly, I think there are some things we should talk about. I nodded. Perhaps there are. He looked down briefly before meeting my eyes again. I am sorry if I made assumptions. The apology was not perfect. It was not dramatic, but it was honest. And sometimes honesty matters more than eloquence. I thanked him and told him we would talk soon. Vanessa stood several feet away beside the passenger door. She offered a polite goodbye but said little else. For the first time since Richard's funeral, she seemed unsure of her footing. As I drove home, I thought about everything that had happened during the past few weeks. The funeral, the whispers, the retirement brochures, the conversations about my future, the assumptions hidden inside expressions of concern. Strangely, I felt no desire to celebrate. Money had never been the point. The $28 million had simply exposed what was already there. Wealth does not change character. It reveals it. By the time I reached home, the sun was beginning to dip lower in the sky. I walked through the front door and paused in the familiar silence. The house no longer felt empty in quite the same way. I still missed Richard. I always would. Some losses never truly leave us. But the confusion that followed his passing had finally lifted. I carried a cup of tea onto the back porch and settled into my chair. The evening air was cool. A gentle breeze moved through the trees. For a long time, I simply sat there thinking. Richard had spent years building financial security. Yet his greatest gift was not the estate he left behind. It was the clarity he left. Me. He gave me the opportunity to see people as they truly were. Not at their best. Not at their worst. Simply as they were when they believed no one was paying attention. I thought about Daniel. I believed there was still time to rebuild what had been damaged. Assumptions can be corrected. Relationships can heal if both people are willing. As for Vanessa, Only time would reveal what lessons she chose to take from this experience. That decision belonged to her alone. The sky slowly turned shades of gold and amber. Somewhere in the distance, a lawn-mower hummed. A dog barked. Ordinary sounds. Ordinary moments. The kind Richard always appreciated. I smiled as I unfolded his letter one final time. My eyes settled on a sentence I had nearly overlooked before. Do not spend your energy proving your worth to people who should already know it. I read those words twice. Then I folded the letter and placed it beside me. The saddest part of the past few weeks was never the money. It was discovering how quickly some people had underestimated me after losing the man who stood beside me for 48 years. But in the end, I did not need revenge. I did not need to prove anything. The truth had done all the work itself. And as the last light of day settled across the backyard, I realized something Richard understood long ago. The most powerful inheritance is not wealth. It is wisdom. And unlike money, wisdom only grows more valuable with time.